Good afternoon, students. Today is Monday, 15 February 2021. This will be our final lecture before the exam, which is on Thursday this week. After the exam, we're going to get started on Chapter 4. So while I have your attention, let me tell you that after the exam on Thursday, you should start reading Chapter 4. Specifically, you should read the section entitled the supererogation objection for the first lecture after the exam. The exam, as I just said, is on Thursday this week. I have to go in and publish the exam, which I will do Thursday morning before 8 o'clock. You have a 12-hour window in which to take the exam between 8 in the morning on Thursday and 8 in the evening on Thursday. But once you go in to take the exam, you have only 75 minutes to complete it. So make sure you're able to finish, make sure you pace yourself properly, and make sure before you log off that you have answered all of the questions. Just a reminder, I posted sample examination questions on Canvas a few days ago. Make sure you at least remember all the answers because these same questions may appear on the exam. And if they do, it will in effect be free points for you. The coverage of the exam, you can tell by looking at the reading list. It has all the sections that we will have covered by Thursday. You're responsible for all of those readings from the book. You're responsible for all of my lectures, everything that I say in my lectures. And you're responsible for all of the handouts that I have posted, unless I say explicitly that they're optional reading. So you've got a lot of material to digest and study before Thursday's exam. So let's get started. Today's lecture shouldn't take all that long, maybe 45 minutes or 50 minutes. We're wrapping up the chapter, or at least the sections of Chapter 3 that we plan to cover. We've already looked at two objections that Mill raised against his own theory. We discussed the doctrine of swine objection, and the last time we met, we discussed the too high for humanity objection. Today, we'll be discussing the third objection, which is called the lack of time objection. In all three cases, the critic's argument takes the form of a modus tollens argument. And in all three cases, Mill grabs the bull by the horn. What that means is he rejects or denies the first premise. The first premise of a modus tollens argument is an if-then sentence. So what Mill is saying three times is that the critic does not understand the theory. With regard to the doctrine of swine objection, Mill says the theory does not imply that only the quantity of pleasure and pain matter. Something else matters in addition to that, namely quality. The quality of the pleasure matters. In the second objection, the too high for humanity objection, the first premise says, in effect, if act utilitarianism is true, then an act is right only if it is motivated by concern for the best interest of humanity as a whole. And Mill denies that. Mill says that his theory does not have that implication. Mill says that his theory, act utilitarianism, or what he calls utilitarianism, implies that, in fact, we maximize overall happiness. It does not say anything at all about the motive with which we act. Okay? So the motive is something separate that should be evaluated separately. The rightness or wrongness of the act depends solely on the actual consequences of the act. Today, we're going to be discussing a third objection, and once again, Mill is going to tell the critic, you do not understand my theory. My theory does not have the implication that you say it does. So let's begin with what Mill actually says, because he raised this objection in his little book. Mill writes as follows: defenders of utility, such as he himself, often find themselves called upon to reply to such objections as this. that there is not time previous to action for calculating and weighing the effects of any line of conduct on the general happiness, unquote. So the critic is saying quite clearly, the problem with this theory is that it requires that we always maximize overall happiness and that we, in effect, constantly be calculating the effects of our actions. And according to the critic, that's not always possible. There's often, or at least sometimes, not enough time to do a calculation. And according to the critic, that reflects badly on the theory. In fact, the critic thinks that refutes the theory. Okay? The theory, according to the critic, implies that we must always be calculating. And according to the critic, there's not always time to do that. Therefore, the theory is false. So let's look at Feldman's formulation of the objection. And I just gave you a rough version. Let's look at the actual words that Feldman uses on page 39. Now remember, Feldman himself is not arguing against the theory. He's putting these words into the mouth of the critic of utilitarianism. So the first premise goes like this. If U7 were true, and maybe it should say, if U7 is true, then it would always be right for us to calculate the utilities of all our alternatives before acting. The key word there is always. The critic thinks that according to this theory, we must always do a calculation before acting. The second premise of this argument, according to the critic, is sometimes it's not right to calculate the utilities of all our alternatives before acting. For example, sometimes there's not enough time to do a calculation, and the critic thinks that in cases like that, then we shouldn't do a calculation. The conclusion of this argument follows logically from the two premises because it's a modus tollens argument. The conclusion is that U7 is not true. So once again, we have modus tollens. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore P. Therefore not P. Now Mill obviously recognizes that this is a valid argument form, so he can't very well deny the validity of it. So Mill, who does not accept the conclusion, must either grab the bull by the horn and reject the first premise, or bite the bullet and reject the second premise. Mill accepts the second premise. The second premise says sometimes it's not right to calculate utilities before acting. Mill accepts that. What Mill has a problem with is the first premise, because the first premise says that the theory requires that we always calculate, and Mill says that's not true. If we have enough time to calculate, yes, we should. But in those cases, maybe rare cases where we don't have time to calculate, we should not calculate. And Mill adds that calculating is itself an act. Do you see that? Getting out a piece of paper with a pen or pencil and trying to do a calculation, as Bentham recommended, that itself is an act. All right, getting out the paper and doing a calculation is an act. Is it right or wrong to perform that act? Well, that depends on the consequences of performing that act as opposed to the consequences of not performing that act. So Mill would say that calculation is right when it produces the best overall consequences. In those cases where it does not produce the best overall consequences, it's wrong. So that's Mill's response in a nutshell. Now, first of all, let's get an example out on the table so we can refer to it. I call it the cement mixer case. I'm not sure what Feldman calls it offhand. I'm not sure he gave it a name, but it involves a cement mixer, which is a big truck loaded with cement, and a baby carriage. I guess we could have called it the baby carriage case, but it's discussed by Feldman on page 38. Now, this is obviously not an example that Mill came up with. There were no cement mixers in Mill's day. There were no automobiles. So obviously this example was created by Feldman. But here it goes. I'll just read a couple of sentences. Suppose a man is standing by the side of a road. He notices an occupied baby carriage roll off the sidewalk and into the path of an oncoming cement mixer. He realizes that no one else will be able to save the baby. His dilemma is to decide what to do. Now, I'm going to stop right there because while Feldman continues the discussion after that, I want to simply get the facts of this case out on the table so that we can analyze it. And we're going to do that as we go along. So we'll come back to the cement mixer case in a moment. Let me first read to you what Mill says about this objection and how he replies to it. I'm reading now from Mill's little book entitled Utilitarianism. Mill says, now that he's stated the objection, Mill's going to reply to it. This is exactly as if anyone were to say that it is impossible to guide our conduct by Christianity because there's not time on every occasion on which anything has to be done to read through the Old and New Testaments. The answer to the objection is that there has been ample time, namely the whole past duration of the human species. During all this time, mankind have been learning by experience the tendencies of actions. So Mill, in his usually concise way, Mill is saying to the critic, wait a minute, are you suggesting that in order to apply utilitarianism to decide what to do, we have to do a full-blown Benthamite calculation on every occasion? That's like saying that in order to apply the moral rules or principles of Christianity, you have to get out the Bible and read through the Old and New Testaments on every occasion. That, of course, is absurd. For one thing, people who are Christians can absorb the main teachings of the religion and apply them in practice on a day-to-day basis, either because they remember the precise rules or they remember the general principles. Love thy neighbor as thyself, which is a general precept of the New Testament. And that can be worked out in a fairly quick way. Suppose you're thinking about lying to somebody, and you're a Christian, and you're wondering whether you should do so. You can simply call to mind very quickly the precept, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You can ask yourself very quickly, would I want to have someone lie to me in a situation like this? And if your answer is no, then you have an answer to your question. Then I shouldn't do it. So your question was, should I lie? A Christian can get an answer to that very quickly without having to go back and reread the entire Bible or just the New Testament. So that's what Mill is saying. If you're a utilitarian, you don't have to recalculate over and over and over again. By the time you reach adulthood, for one thing, you will have already been involved in many situations. You will know by then that murdering people is probably not an act that will maximize overall happiness. You will probably know that lying, in the vast majority of cases, does not maximize overall happiness. You will probably know that keeping your promises does, in the vast majority of cases, maximize overall happiness. So just as Christians make use of intermediate principles that don't require a great deal of time to reread the Bible, utilitarians can make use of what Mill calls rules of thumb. A rule of thumb is a kind of intermediate rule that helps you apply utilitarianism. For example, a particular rule of thumb for a utilitarian may be tell the truth, keep your promises, don't batter people. In other words, don't go around punching people. And the justification for these rules of thumb is that more often than not, following the rule will maximize overall happiness. So when Mill says we learn by experience the tendencies of actions, what he means is that we have built up a body of experience as we live our lives, and that experience is crystallized in the form of these rules of thumb. And as we live our lives on a day-to-day basis, we don't have to do fresh calculations all the time. We can simply act on the basis of rules of thumb. So if you've ever made a promise and the time comes to keep it, just fall back on the rule of thumb and keep the promise. If you are tempted to lie to someone, fall back on the rule of thumb that says don't lie and refrain from lying. If you're tempted to punch somebody, fall back on the rule of thumb that says don't harm others. So these rules of thumb, Mill says, are summaries of past experience, our own experience plus the experience of other human beings. So human beings collectively have developed what you might call a body of experience and crystallized that experience in the form of various rules. And the rules are what we act upon on a day-to-day basis. Now, let's be clear about something. Mill is not ruling out doing a calculation. He's not ruling that out. What he's saying is most of the time we don't need to do a calculation because we have these rules of thumb. But suppose you find yourself in a novel situation where there doesn't seem to be a rule of thumb that applies, or maybe more than one rule of thumb comes into play and they conflict with one another. In a case like that, you will want to do a calculation, assuming you have the time. And very often we do have the time, don't we? We're not always in emergency situations, like in the cement mixer case. For example, suppose you're wondering, suppose you have a family and you live in Texas. Suppose your children are in public schools and they're very happy. They have friends. They like the neighborhood. You have a job opportunity in another city. It will require that you move your entire family to that city. Your children will have to enter a new school. They will have to leave their friends and neighbors behind. There will be obviously it will be traumatic for them. Maybe eventually they will make new friends and be just as happy, but maybe not. So you're giving up a known good in favor of an unknown good. So in a case like that, you probably have the luxury of doing a calculation. You can get out a piece of paper if you want to formalize it. You can draw a line down the middle, and on the top of the left column, you can say, move to the new city. And on the top of the right column, you can say, stay put. And then you can start listing the effects of those actions on yourself, your family members, and others. And you can try to quantify them, as Bentham did. And at the bottom of each column, there will be a sum of net pleasures. And you should simply compare the bottom line of those two columns to decide what to do. So that's an example of an actual calculation that you might do to determine what the right thing for you to do is. So Mill would say, if you're making an important decision and you have the luxury of time to do a calculation, by all means do the calculation. Right? That way you increase the likelihood that you do the right thing. And as a utilitarian, obviously, your goal is to do the right thing. So Mill's position is subtle. Mill says, when you can do a calculation, do so. In those cases, which may be rare, where you don't have time to do a calculation, fall back on those rules of thumb that we discussed earlier. And remember, the rules of thumb must always be justified by their likelihood of maximizing utility. So it's a three-tiered structure. Now, I don't have a blackboard to write this on, so I'm going to slowly explain it to you. At the very top, if you want to do this in your notes, you may do so. In fact, I have it in my notes. Maybe I can show you what it looks like. You see here on the back of my sheet, right over here, I have a couple of arrows. I have the words principle of utility. Then I have down immediately below it a downward pointing arrow. Then I have the term rules of thumb. Then below that, another arrow, downward pointing. And then down below that, the words concrete acts. So what that shows is that in that when we're applying the principle of utility, which is the ultimate principle for a utilitarian, when you apply the principle of utility, you don't necessarily apply it directly to concrete acts. There's nothing wrong with having intermediate maxims, if we want to call them that, intermediate rules that go in between the principle, which is fairly abstract, and the concrete act, which is a particular. Okay, so Mill is saying, in reply to this lack of time objection, Mill is saying there's no reason a utilitarian can't have intermediate generalizations, or what we've been calling rules of thumb. One of my teachers, Joel Feinberg, in a book of his, called these mediating maxims, because they mediate means go between. So these are maxims that go in between the principle of utility and the concrete act down here. So we have three names for the same thing. Okay, rule of thumb, which is what we've been calling them, mediating maxim, which is what Joel Feinberg calls them, and what we might call intermediate generalizations. And that's the sort of thing, that's the sort of language I think that Mill would choose, because he was a great logician and he used the term generalization a lot. In fact, Mill thinks that most principles and rules are generalizations from experience. Right? We gather experience on a day-to-day basis as we live our lives, and from that experience we accumulate these generalizations. We make generalizations about the world. So I think Mill would probably prefer the word generalization rather than rule of thumb. But I use the term rules of thumb because you've probably heard it before. Now, Mill had a certain wit to him, and if you look at page 39, you can get a feel for his wit. Feldman quotes him from his book Utilitarianism on page 39. Having said what I quoted a moment ago, Mill says the following: "It is truly a whimsical supposition that if mankind were agreed in considering utility to be the test of morality, they would remain without any agreement as to what is useful, and would take no measures for having their notions on the subject taught to the young and enforced by law and opinion. There's no difficulty in proving any ethical standard whatever to work ill if we suppose universal idiocy to be conjoined with it. But on any hypothesis short of that, mankind must by this time have acquired positive beliefs as to the effects of some actions on their happiness." So these are famous words. First of all, whimsical supposition, but later Mill says universal idiocy. What Mill is saying there is any moral theory, whether it's utilitarianism, egoism, Kantianism, or any other theory, any theory will produce bad results if we conjoin it to universal idiocy. So if you assume that an idiot is applying utilitarianism, then of course you're going to get bad results. But then again, if an idiot is applying Kantianism, you're going to get bad results. If an idiot is applying egoism, you're going to get bad results. It would be like a motor vehicle. A motor vehicle works just fine if it's operated properly. But if you put an idiot behind the wheel, you're going to get some bad results. So I always like quoting Mill because he does display his wit here and there in this otherwise dry and abstract book. Now let's come back to the cement mixer case. What would you do? Not what would you do, but what should you do in a case like that? Well, look at Feldman's list of possible actions for the cement mixer case. These are listed on page 39. If you were to do a calculation, you would have to list all the available acts and then do a calculation to see what their utility is. And at the end of that process, you would perform whichever act maximizes overall utility. So Feldman comes up with the following, and this list shows Feldman's wit a little bit. First act, remove baby carriage from road. So run out, grab the carriage, get it off the road before the cement mixer strikes it. Remember, there's a baby in the carriage, and you know that. So what would be the utility of that act? Plus 50. That would have a pretty high utility relative to the other acts. A second thing you might do is to shout at the truck driver. Hey, truck driver, we got a baby on the road in front of you. Slow down, stop, or swerve. Now, there are problems with that, obviously. The truck driver may not hear you above the din. It may be too late. So by the time the truck driver hears you and understands what you're saying and takes action to correct the course, it may be too late. So the utility of that is minus 10, according to Feldman. Third, cover your eyes to avoid seeing the ensuing crash. Right? That way, at least you are not traumatized by it. Minus 8, Feldman says. Fourth, call an ambulance. Whip out your cell phone, call 911. That's obviously going to be a problem. There won't be near enough time for an ambulance to get there. Although the ambulance may arrive after the collision, and the baby may somehow have survived it, and the ambulance may be able to save the baby's life. So Feldman assigns that act minus 9. And finally, remember what I said earlier, calculation is itself an act, and therefore it can be right or wrong to calculate. Calculate the utilities of alternatives, Feldman says minus 10. Why? Because by the time you get done calculating, the events will have unfolded, and in all likelihood the baby will have been struck and either seriously injured or killed. So if these are the acts available to you, what's the right thing to do? Well, as you know by now, it's whichever act is at the top of the ranking. If there's a tie, remember, you could perform either act, and you must perform at least one of those acts that are tied. In this case, there's no tie. It's plus 50. So the right thing to do is to run out and save the baby, get the carriage off the road before the cement mixer arrives. Notice something. All the other acts are wrong. There's one right act in this case, and all the other ones are wrong. And so calculating the utilities of the alternatives is wrong. Not only is it not obligatory for you to calculate utilities, it's forbidden. Why is it forbidden? Because remember what that means. Forbidden means it's wrong to do it and right not to. In this case, it's wrong to do it because there's another act, saving the baby, that has higher utility than it has. So saving the baby is obligatory. Calculating is not just wrong, it's forbidden. You mustn't do it. Okay, so that's the point of the baby carriage example. It's to illustrate Mill's point that sometimes you shouldn't calculate. Sometimes you must not calculate utilities. So Mill, in response to this objection, grabs the bull by the horn, doesn't he? Go back to the objection. The first premise says if U7 is true, then it's always right to calculate. Mill says that's false. U7 does not imply that it's always right to calculate. The very most that U7 implies is that it's sometimes right to calculate. It's right in those cases where calculation maximizes utility, and it's wrong otherwise. So here's how Feldman puts it at this point on page 39. Mill suggests that any reasonable, reflective, properly trained adult would know what to do in a case such as this one. He would use the moral principles he learned as a child. There's no need to use U7 to figure out what to do in such a case. So you would simply fall back on the rule of thumb. What rule of thumb would that be? It would be something like save vulnerable people from great harm. Right? Whenever you can, intervene and prevent people from dying or being seriously injured, you should do so. And that's a pretty simple rule. You can teach it to a child. It's simple and straightforward enough to be learned by a child, remembered by a child, and certainly remembered and learned by an adult. It's a rule of thumb. And in this case, once you size up the situation, you immediately invoke your rule of thumb. You rush out into the street, remove the baby carriage, the cement truck goes by harmlessly. Now, we have a problem here, or at least a puzzle. Feldman goes on to discuss it. The puzzle is this. In the cement mixer case, we didn't end up using U sub 7. So Feldman says on page 40, what's the point of formulating a theory of moral rightness, such as U sub 7, if we don't use it to determine what actions would be morally right? That's the puzzle. Now, I hope by now you can see the solution of the puzzle. We did use U7, but we didn't use U7 to apply directly to the act. We used U7 to formulate the rules of thumb, and then when we found ourselves in the emergency situation, we invoked the rule of thumb and applied it to decide what to do very quickly. So Feldman is suggesting that U sub 7 is useful only if it's applied to acts directly, but it doesn't have to be applied directly. U sub 7 is our principle if we're utilitarians. That is our principle. We don't wait for emergency situations to arise and then try to apply that that principle to them. When we have the luxury, we formulate rules of thumb that more often than not, if followed, would maximize overall happiness. And then once we get a collection of rules of thumb, we use them in emergency situations when we don't have time to do a calculation. Now, these rules of thumb, I hope you can see, must be fairly general in nature because they've got to cover a number of different concrete acts. They will have to do with generic acts like lying and keeping promises and harming people. So the rules of thumb, in order to be useful as rules of thumb, they must be general in nature rather than particular. They must be fairly simple so that they can be learned and taught and remembered and applied in emergency situations. So it's important that these rules be carefully formulated and taught to children. So I suspect most parents already do this. Even though they're not utilitarians, they probably teach their children some basic rules. Tell the truth. Keep your promises. Respect your elders. Refrain from hitting people. Right? All of these rules can be set aside in particular situations. In other words, you may find that a particular lie maximizes overall happiness, in which case you should tell the lie. But in the vast majority of cases, these rules, if followed, will maximize overall utility. Okay, so the lesson here is that act utilitarians like Mill can make use of rules. They can and do and should make use of rules. The rules are not absolute, right? That means that the rules themselves may be dispensed with in particular cases. So if you have a rule of thumb that says tell the truth, there may be a case, probably rare, where it's permissible not to tell the truth. It may be even obligatory not to tell the truth. So lying could end up being the right thing to do. There may be a particular case where breaking a promise maximizes overall happiness. If so, the act utilitarian would say, then break the promise. There may come a case where striking someone or battering someone maximizes overall utility. Remember the rattlesnake case? I pushed someone away from the rattlesnake, it could have been a very sharp blow. It could have left a bruise. Maybe I pushed the person so hard that it left a bruise or a mark, and we assumed that the person fell into a cactus, which would be painful, right? So the rule of thumb is don't batter or harm people, and yet in that particular case, because of the circumstances, that was not only not impermissible, it was required, right? Utilitarianism required that you inflict harm, but the harm was designed to avert or prevent an even greater harm, which is being bitten by a rattlesnake. So what I'm trying to impress upon you is the following. Act utilitarians can make use of rules, but they don't use those rules as though they were absolute rules never to be broken. Sometimes rules of thumb should be broken. When you have done a calculation and you know that breaking them will maximize overall utility. Okay, so tell the truth unless and until not telling the truth is utility maximizing, in which case you may tell a falsehood. So here's the puzzle Feldman has raised. If U7 is not being used at all, what's the point of it? And that raises the question, what is the point of a moral theory anyway? Is the purpose of a moral theory to give us the truth about right and wrong? In other words, is a moral theory designed to provide us with a criterion of rightness, a statement of necessary and sufficient conditions for rightness? Or is a moral theory designed to be useful in the real world as we live our lives on a day-to-day basis? In other words, when we formulate a moral theory like U7, are we doing theoretical normative ethics or practical normative ethics? Theoretical normative ethics is a search for truth, a criterion. Practical normative ethics is a search for a useful principle that can actually give us guidance on a day-to-day basis as we live our lives. So if Mill, now follow along here, it's not clear how Mill intended his theory to be used. So all we can say is if Mill intended it this way, then such and such, and if Mill intended it some other way, then so and so. So here we go. If in fact, I'm quoting from Feldman right now, page 41. If Mill intended his principle to be a guide to action, that is, a principle of practical normative ethics, then the objection, referring here to the lack of time objection, points to a defect in Mill's proposal. This defect is that U7 is too hard to apply. It's not well suited to the task of helping us make quick moral decisions. Okay, that's the first if. If Mill meant for U7 to be practical, then the lack of time objection is a problem for him. Okay? Now, what if Mill didn't have that in mind? What if Mill intended for U7 to be a theoretical principle? Here is what Feldman says also on page 41. If Mill had been engaged in theoretical normative ethics, remember that's a search for truth, then the lack of time objection could be rebutted easily, for the inapplicability of the principle in no way detracts from its truth, assuming that it's true. So what Feldman is saying is we don't know how Mill intended his theory U7. If he intended it this way, then there's a problem. If he intended it some other way, there's not a problem. Which way would be a problem? It would be a problem if Mill intended his theory, U7, to be practical and useful, because we've seen in the cement mixer case, it's not useful. But if Mill intended for U sub 7 to be a theoretical principle designed to get us the truth about right and wrong, then the cement mixer case would not be a problem. Right? Mill would never be claiming that the theory is useful in the real world. What he would be saying is that the theory gives us a certain type of knowledge of what it is exactly that makes an act right or wrong. So how should we interpret Mill? We've got a decision to make. It's an interpretive decision. Mill's little book does not tell us how to understand U sub 7. So we have to decide how to interpret Mill, how to read him. And here's what Feldman says, page 41. Unfortunately, it's not clear whether Mill was engaged in practical normative ethics or in theoretical normative ethics. So Feldman is going to make an assumption. We don't know which is true, which is the case. So going forward, we need to make an assumption. Well, which assumption should we make? We want to be fair to Mill. Right? When you're interpreting somebody, especially somebody who's making an argument, always strive to be charitable or fair. What that means is always put the best spin, always put the best, most favorable interpretation on what others are saying. And then, once you've put the best interpretation on it, then if you want, you can go ahead and criticize it. What you should not do is put the worst interpretation on what someone says and then attack it. Okay, that's cheating. That's not fair. In fact, apply the golden rule. What if you wrote something and one of your readers, suppose something you said was not clear. There were two interpretations of it, this one and this one. Some reader of what you wrote recognizes the ambiguity, the fact that there are two plausible interpretations. One of them creates a problem for you, the other one does not. Now, wouldn't it be unfair if the critic put the interpretation on what you wrote that is not favorable to you? I think it was this one over here. You would not like that, would you? You would say, wait a minute. Why would you choose the unfavorable interpretation of what I wrote? Why would you not choose the favorable one? If you would want your critics to choose the favorable interpretation of what you wrote, then according to the golden rule, you should do the same for others or to others. Always strive to put the best spin on what others say before you proceed to criticize it. Another way to put it is this. You expect to be given the benefit of the doubt. Therefore, by the golden rule, you should give others the benefit of the doubt. One thing you should never do is give others the detriment of the doubt. You probably haven't heard that term. I think I coined it myself years ago. You can give someone the benefit of the doubt or the detriment of the doubt. The benefit of the doubt is putting a favorable spin or interpretation on what the person wrote. The detriment of the doubt means putting an unfavorable spin or a bad spin on it. So always interpret others favorably. Well, that's what Feldman is going to do. Feldman says on page 41 that he's going to assume, for the sake of going forward, that, quote, U7 was intended by Mill to be a principle of theoretical normative ethics. Why does Feldman assume that? Because the alternative interpretation that Mill meant for U sub 7 to be practical leads to problems for him, right? Because we don't always have time to do a calculation. So let's interpret Mill from now on as putting forward U sub 7 as a theoretical principle designed to give us the truth about right and wrong. Okay, before I leave you today, In another of his books, a book entitled On Liberty, published in 1859, John Stuart Mill, who's the author we've been discussing, John Stuart Mill set forth a number of rules. And while he didn't say that they are rules of thumb, I think it's safe to interpret him as saying that. So here are those rules that I transposed to my lecture notes from his book On Liberty. You can think of these as John Stuart Mill's rules of thumb, or at least some of his rules of thumb. And as I read them to you, try to imagine a young child, a child of, say, 10 years of age, hearing these, and ask yourself whether that child would be able to understand them, memorize them, learn them, and apply them. First, Mill wrote, don't encroach on other people's rights. Don't encroach on other people's rights. Now you could say, don't violate other people's rights. A child might understand that a little better than encroach. Okay, so if you know that someone has a right to speak, don't encroach on that, right? Don't censor it. Don't try to silence the person. Don't start screaming and yelling so that the person can't be heard. Okay, that's a simple rule, a rule of thumb. Second, don't inflict any loss or damage unless it's justified by your own rights. So don't inflict loss or damage on others. Don't harm other people unless it's justified by your own rights. So if you have a right to do something and incidentally your doing it causes loss or damage to someone, you may still do it, especially if your rights are important rights and the loss is minimal. So notice Mill is saying, here's the rule, don't inflict loss or damage on others, and then he builds in an exception to it that's easy to remember, unless it's justified by your own rights. So you get to inflict loss or damage on others if you are in the right, if you have a right to do what you're doing. Third, don't use falsehood or duplicity in dealing with others. I think a child of 10 could easily understand that. Don't use falsehood or duplicity. Duplicity is a synonym for lying. Don't deceive other people. Right? That's a very useful rule of thumb. And I think you can see why following that rule on a day-to-day basis would maximize overall happiness. Okay, two more. Number 4, don't use unfair or ungenerous advantages over others. Now, I would put that a little simpler. Don't take advantage of others. If someone is, suppose it's a very hot day in Texas, and you are out in the middle of nowhere, and suppose maybe you're riding your bike, and you have 2 full water bottles. You come across someone who's walking. Suppose there's no way for you to put the person on the bike and ride that person somewhere. What if you, instead of stopping and offering the person water, what if you stopped and said, are you okay? And the person says, I don't know, I'm getting dizzy. I think I'm so thirsty that I'm going into heat stroke or heat exhaustion. What if you, instead of offering water, said, I'll tell you what, I've got some water here. If you've got $20, I'll give you a couple of drinks of my water, or $50 or whatever. I think we would all say that's morally reprehensible. You're taking advantage of somebody's predicament. You're extorting money from somebody who's in great need and who is suffering. So I think that's what Mill's talking about. Don't use unfair or ungenerous advantages over others. Don't take advantage of other people's misery or misfortune. And finally, defend others from injury. And that would apply in the cement mixer case, wouldn't it? Defend others from injury. That applies perfectly to the cement mixer case. So here is Mill himself giving us a list of useful rules, which we can call rules of thumb, and one of them applies directly to Feldman's example of the cement mixer. So Mill would say, by all means, do not calculate the utilities in the cement mixer case. Fall back on the rule of thumb that says defend others from injury. And then you're more likely than not to maximize utility if you follow that rule. Okay, well, that's enough for today. We're 50 minutes in, which is about what I expected. I have now covered the first 3 sections of Chapter 3, and those are the only 3 that we are going to cover of Chapter 3. The exam is on Thursday. I need to go in Thursday morning, and I will, and publish the exam. So if you went there now, you wouldn't be able to get in there, obviously. And remember, it's open from 8 till 8 that day, 8 in the morning till 8 in the evening. You have 75 minutes to complete it. So once you go in there, make sure you're all ready. Make sure you've studied properly and do the best you can. Make sure you answer all the questions and take note of your final score when you, now I don't know exactly how it works, but I assume that when you log out of the exam, it will show you your score, points out of 100. And I will be able to go in afterward and I can see everyone's score. And what I will do is I will over the weekend compile statistics for your class. I'll compile the average score, the mean score, the median score, and things like that. And I'll break it down by percentile, right? How many people were in the 90s, 80s, 70s, and so on. So the next time I see you after today will be a week from today, or probably a week from tomorrow, which is Tuesday next week. And before you watch my lecture that day, please read the section entitled, let me make sure I have it correct, it's entitled Supererogatory Actions. It's the first section of Chapter 4. Okay, so that's what lies ahead of us. Exam Thursday, and read that section before Tuesday. I will probably post something on Canvas that sets out all the statistics. Rather than taking up time on my lecture, my videotape lecture, I'll just post a handout for you. Okay, that's enough for today. Have a good day. Good luck in your studying. And unless I hear from you, the next time I talk to you will be Tuesday on the video. So long.